Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Mercedes are pulling out all the stops to recover their 2023 season, with rumours emerging that they are hauling back former technical chief James Allison back to oversee the development of the W14 throughout the season. George Russell also gives some optimism that their car is not as flawed as last year's and can still make significant progress. Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. Loads of new subs the last few days. Every team though is looking for improvement. Aston Martin say they've got an aggressive development plan over the course of the season. The AMR23 is going to change a lot from now to the end of the year. Alonso even said that 2/3 of the car will be updated by the end of the season. So they've got a big plan in place, and it might be honestly the only hope of some sort of title challenge this season, given how Ferrari and Mercedes messed up over the winter. Is Aston Martin to pull off some sort of miracle and actually upgrade their car significantly over the course of the season? Thing is though, Red Bull aren't resting on their laurels either. Despite having a massive advantage currently over the field, they've got another significant upgrade coming in Baku. So if you thought the season was over already, yeah, this probably puts the nail in the coffin if this works. I'm sure that, in terms of the competitiveness of the season, if this upgrade for Red Bull works like Ferrari's upgrade did halfway through last season and actually takes them backwards, then, maybe there's still a season on here, but unlikely to be the case. Ferrari, of course, have got big problems to solve. Their car, actually, the SF23, was an identical pace to last year's car. So last year, all the cars were slower right at the start of last season, but on race pace, last year's Ferrari was exactly the same as this year's Ferrari. The Mercedes wasn't too dissimilar either. The Red Bull, for example, was 8/10 faster than last year's car on average, which is about what you'd expect across the field, to be honest. But Ferrari and Mercedes couldn't make that jump at all, and therefore they find themselves in a tricky position when Red Bull also had more in the tank, of course, than just those 8/10 of a second. These were the gaps over the course of the race. We're talking about 6/10 to Ferrari, 6/10 to Aston, and then maybe Aston slightly quicker than that actually, and then Mercedes, we're talking more like a second back on Red Bull based on the conservation that Red Bull were doing with the tyres, with a couple of reliability concerns they did have throughout the race because they turned their engine power down as well. So Red Bull ominous as always. But Mercedes, I think, is quite clear. They can't design a car quite as well as they could a few years ago. Now, Michael Schmidt from Amos says this might well be down, and I think it is probably down, to losing some of the key guys from their aero department over the last few years. It's a natural thing when a team dominates the sport for 8 years in a row that some of those guys are going to get poached elsewhere. Red Bull came along, took a few of Mercedes' top guys. Aston Martin came along, took one or two of Mercedes' top guys, and that's just how it's going to be. There's going to be flux between teams. Engineers that were dominating at Mercedes for some time, they get offered more money to go elsewhere, new challenge, and that's what they're going to do. So having the rebuild at Mercedes is probably necessary to a certain extent, but also one of their top guys, James Allison, he departed from overseeing the car side of Ineos at Mercedes, and of course the partnership they have, to go and work on boats effectively for the last couple of years. So James Allison is rumoured to be returning. Now, this is from the Italian press. It's not been substantiated by any other report or Mercedes themselves yet, but we'll see, because it's quite an interesting report, especially because it does make a little bit of sense. They know that they've got a lot of work to do on their car. There's a world in which Toto Wolff said, hey, Allison, get back in now, we need you type thing, because he's kind of left active duty on the Mercedes Formula 1 team. The head of technical operations has apparently now put his hand to, or is overseeing, the updates that are arriving at Imola, whatever they might be. The top speed of the W14 is okay. They've solved some of their issues. I think it bounces probably the least of any car on the grid, according to what George Russell has to say, but it just straight up lacks downforce, and that's going to be brutal for them, I imagine, in Jeddah, where there's a lot of high-speed corners where the downforce is absolutely necessary. So this is James Allison. If you guys have probably seen this face before over the years, was working at Mercedes for a fair bit of time, oversaw some of their most dominant cars, such as the W11, but in the recent, I think maybe a year and a bit ago, he decided to go and work on boats, which I believe Adrian Newey, chief technical guy at Red Bull, also did about 8 or so years ago, and Red Bull had to coax him back from boats to come and work on their F1 project again. Of course, Newey has proved, I'm sure, invaluable given the transition to the ground effect era, which Mercedes have not nailed, and probably because they don't have some of the top guys they used to have, especially for such a big transition. So bringing James Allison back to oversee this is definitely, good news, I would say, for Mercedes, and he's probably got a good idea of the direction they could take to add downforce to the car. And George Russell says here in a second, the car isn't terrible by all the metrics they had last year. There's definitely more scope for improvement here, but the way they improve is, the big question for them to answer, because if they just copy Red Bull, that's probably not going to cut the mustard. So what are they going to cook up here, right? And what is James Allison potentially cooking behind the scenes if he is returning to full-time work overseeing the Mercedes F1 division. And as I say, well, like Toto Wolff has probably been on the phone to some of his guys like, please come and help us out here because we are struggling. And, you know, Mr. Mike Elliott might have his job on the line at some point. We'll see. But Michael Schmidt also from Amos says Mercedes has 2 variants ready as an alternative. Goes on to say that this season's goals have been achieved by Mercedes, but they were seemingly set too low. I don't think Mercedes are massively surprised by where they are. I think they're more so surprised by what Aston have achieved with half of the Mercedes parts. Like the fact that Mercedes have been outdone by their own customer with their own parts is obviously pretty embarrassing, but also how far Red Bull are down the road. Mercedes seem pretty shocked about, like, they set their own goals, which they achieved, but they're just so far behind where they want to be. So the latest rumor as regards to what upgrades they're going to bring is that the current W14 project, or the concept, is something of a hybrid between what the W13 was and the project that will be brought to the track at the end of April for, I think that's maybe the Baku Grand Prix, roughly about that time. And then Imola, I think, is kind of mid-May when they might be bringing some further upgrades. We'll see. But the current car is apparently effectively a W14 prototype, so it doesn't porpoise, it doesn't bottom out, it doesn't have drag, which is good. So there are some positive elements to take away from the W14, and apparently the idea was to kind of evaluate the fact that, you know, does the efficiency of the power unit, is it good? Like, there are some positives to take, although Toto Wolff didn't seem to take too many because he was looking at the timing sheets and the numbers don't lie at the end of the day. And Russell did say, look, if we have to sacrifice the first half of the season to understand what to do going forward, change the concept in the necessary, meaningful ways they need to have a good second half of the season, then they will do just that. And that would be sacrificing both championships, but that might be what they need to do to even have a chance of winning next year, to be honest, in addition to trying to bring back maybe James Allison or bolster that development team to a certain extent, because their development over the course of the year is still good. We saw that last year with the W13, but the actual designing of a car does not seem to be as good as it was a few years ago, especially for the new set of regulations that we now inhabit. So George Russell actually goes on to say this: we've got this skinny side pod concept. The reason why we have it is because we still believe that is best. And to be honest, I still believe that's not going to transform our performance if we came next week with a Red Bull style side pod. It's basically saying we're not just going to copy Red Bull. Now, they have admitted, Mercedes, they will be changing that part of the car. Whether it looks distinctly different, whether they do just copy the Red Bull side pod design, whether they copy what Aston Martin have got, whether they go an entirely different approach remains to be seen. Toto Wolff did say that a 0.3 of a second upgrade isn't going to cut it, and they've got to be more radical with the way they redesign that part of the car. But they did say before the season even began, when they launched the car, they had something new in the wind tunnel already to replace that part anyway as part of their upgraded concept they're doing. And as I say, maybe that new upgraded concept they're bringing in a couple of months' time will be significantly and radically different to what they were even planning to do, just because of the gap they have to Red Bull, right? They might have had a nice strong plan. Okay, the W14, it works effectively. Now we've got to take the next step. But Red Bull are just so far away, they might just have to be more radical with the changes they make. And George Russell says a lot of it comes down to the floor. That, in fairness, is where a lot of the downforce is generated with these current crop of cars. And he says that's where the magic is done, and the parts of the car that we can't see. Just changing the Red Bull style side pod and chucking it on the Mercedes is not going to magically find us half a second, and they're going to need more than that. He confirms, of course, it's a big blow, a long way behind where they want to be, but there is some positives to take away, as in there's no fundamental problem with the car other than it's lacking downforce, which obviously is quite a big problem. But as he says, as silly as it sounds, that's probably one of the easiest problems to solve if you compare it to this time last year. Last year they had the bouncing, they didn't know what was causing it, and while they fixed the bouncing kind of in Spain, they uncovered more problems. The car was bottoming out. They had loads of issues with the W13 last year. They have solved a lot of those for this year's car, but it just doesn't have the downforce right. It's quicker in a straight line, but from the floor, I'm guessing, is where George Russell's looking at here. That's where they're just lacking downforce right now. He does reckon that's an easier problem to solve than the issues they had before, which maybe means they can get on par with, or at least somewhere near, Red Bull sooner than they were able to last season. So maybe some optimism here for Mercedes that they can move in the right direction, but they'll have to nail it, and they'll have to get it right with these radical concept changes they're going to make over the coming months. And maybe James Allison, if he is back, can oversee that into a successful conclusion. The other point here as well from George Russell is that nobody remembers who finishes second or third. Second isn't good enough. We need to make radical changes, or drastic changes as he describes them. And I do wonder whether at Ferrari have a different philosophy to Mercedes. Ferrari are like, our car's fine, it's just a setup problem. We'll dial it in, our car's good, and we'll get it solved. Which maybe they're right, but it almost almost feels in a way that they're kind of not settling for second precisely, but it doesn't seem like Ferrari are as annoyed coming seconds than Mercedes are, and that's just one of the reasons I think that Mercedes have a better chance out of the two to actually be on top, let's say next year, or even at the end of this season, is maybe still possible. So yes, another concept coming in the works for Mercedes. James Allison could be a big part of that, but if they are going to make radical changes, it's going to take quite some time, I think, until anyone, with the exception of maybe Aston Martin and Alonso, can actually challenge this man, Max Verstappen. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.